Speak up for what's right. The David Webb Show. 866-957-2874.
866-95-PATRIOT, 957-2874. On Twitter at David Webb Show. And, of course, you can always get us on demand, SiriusXM.com/on demand. And it works out nicely that way. So, if you miss something, you want to share something, maybe something you just heard in the interview with Major General Bob Dees, you can send it to your friends, share it with them, however you do that. 10 of our Navy sailors released unharmed by Iran one day after they were, and now the questions arise, were they taken? Was there a problem with the boat? We're getting conflicting reports that conflict with the early reports from both the Obama administration and Iran's senior military leadership. We will find out in time. Troubling to many is the picture and the heavily edited footage that the Iranian government is now using to show a capture or portray a capture, our sailors being held by soldiers from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard with weapons, hands above their heads. Our female sailor had to wear a head covering. Questions and debated in the political world, but questions still stand, and who knows what we'll find out in due time. Another area and a problem that is unresolved and has been unresolved for many years, for decades, as a matter of fact, is the issue of North Korea. The back and forth of late has been everything from broadcasts from South Korea into North Korea. Now we have a response with drones dropping leaflets from and balloons dropping leaflets from North Korea into South Korea, and the back and forth continues. But the real question, and the important question that plagues many right now, is the test or the supposed test of a hydrogen bomb. There was a vote in the House, and both Republicans and Democrats voted to unanimously impose harsher legislation. Back to the show, an old friend of the show, not an old man, but an old friend of the show, Dr. William Parker, Chief Operating Officer at the East-West Institute, former senior naval officer with a PhD from George Mason in molecular biology. Too many PhDs here, or too many degrees, molecular and microbiology, and a master's in public administration from the JFK School of Government at Harvard, and so much more. You are just a man of many letters and much experience, my friend. How are you?
David, I'm doing great. It's always good to be on your show and talk to your great audience.
Well, good to have you here. And by the way, I should mention that you have a forthcoming book in 2016, Guaranteeing America's Security in the 21st Century. Of course, we fully expect you to come on here and tell us all about the book when it's time to get it out to the rest of the world. Let's tackle the issue of North Korea. But first, how you would see this from the East-West Institute's perspective, what you do at the Institute.
That's great. I'll tell you, at East-West, what we do is we really work to reduce international conflict. And you've worked with us before in other organizations. But at the end of the day, what we do is we look at those seemingly intractable problems that threaten world security, and we work to stabilize those by working what I'll call above and below the waterline. But we work with leaders around the world to ensure that the world stays as safe as we can possibly keep it. And as bad as things are today, they can be a lot worse if you don't have these kind of conversations on a regular basis.
I mentioned North Korea in my introduction. A pause for a moment before we get to North Korea, and if I could interject here, your quick thought on what happened near the island of Farsi with Iran and our riverine boats.
Sure. I've spent a decent amount of time over there. About 16, 17 years of my career was spent transiting back and forth in that area. I can assure you of this. They were well-trained, great Americans that were on those boats. Those Navy sailors are among the best that the nation has to offer. And you could see clear abuse to mariners in distress. If, in fact, one of those boats broke down or they were disoriented for a navigation reason, whatever that would be, those are mariners in distress as opposed to somebody conducting a combat operation. It's certainly reasonable that if you have two militaries and perhaps one strayed into the other's water, I don't know that for sure, that they'd perhaps want to make sure that folks weren't armed to injure them or fight back. You could argue that point perhaps, but what you can't argue is that those mariners should have instantly been turned back over, helped out, given water, help them with their engines, whatever needed, and then turn right back over to the United States Navy. Everything else that happened after that was an abomination at best.
And we do have international conventions under the Geneva Convention and even, shall we say, within the UN structures that guide us on this, to your point, don't we?
We absolutely do. And in addition to that, we just have the standards of the way mariners perform at sea, and then we take care of each other when we're at sea. And if you're in distress, you help each other out and you press on, as opposed to what appears to be significant abuse here by the Iranians in this case.
Well, we may well get back to Iran in this discussion, but now let's shift to North Korea. And been in the news a lot lately, as I said before. House approved sanctions today, a bipartisan vote, unanimous in the House. We'll see what happens in the Senate. And latest reports of South Korea firing warning shots within the last 12 to 15 hours at a suspected drone near the border. Is this saber rattling that's going on that we've seen for the years? And this has a history in their nuclear program and their missile program. So that history that leads us to where we are now.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, this is the fourth nuclear test. The third was in 2013. But this whole thing really started as far back as 1985. Back in December, North Korea acceded to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but they do not agree to complete the Safeguards Agreement. And that started in 85. And then 91, Bush announces the unilateral withdrawal of all naval and land tactical nukes. And soon after that, Gorbachev does the same thing. So that was good news. By 92, more than 6 years after signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty, North Korea concluded comprehensive safeguards assigned to the IAEA, and this process continued. But then what started to happen is more and more North Korea started puffing their chest out and realizing that they could get away with these nuclear tests and continued longer-range weapons, missiles in particular, and I'm sure you've seen, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later, the submarine-launched ballistic missile. Whether or not that actually happened, we can discuss. But the bottom line is they're working at, and they've succeeded at building some long-range missiles, and they've succeeded at building some sort of nuclear program. Whether or not this was an actual test of a hydrogen bomb, and we can talk about the difference between an atomic and a hydrogen bomb if you'd like to later.
Well, can we clarify that briefly for the audience before we get too far down? The difference between hydrogen and atomic.
Sure. So when you talk about the difference between the two, really what you're talking about is the difference between fusion and fission. Okay, so an atomic bomb is all about fission. You're breaking up large atoms, they're either uranium or plutonium, and you're doing that in a supercritical chain reaction. A hydrogen bomb, you've also probably heard of, called a thermonuclear bomb. It uses fusion in a chain reaction. Now, in order to start that chain reaction, you have to get something that gets real hot. And it ends up the only thing we can get hot enough is an atomic bomb. So when you're talking hydrogen bomb or thermonuclear bomb, what it really is it starts with an atomic bomb and then starts that chain reaction to trigger it, and then proceeds from there.
Okay, now let's move along. My guest, by the way, Dr. William Parker, retired naval officer and chief operating officer at the East-West Institute. So now let's get back in this North Korean, and I'm glad we clarified that. Often people hear the terms, they're not sure. But now, the brag, and that's what I call it, that North Korea says we now can reach the United States. Is that even possible, even in a high-altitude detonation?
So when you start talking about whether or not they can reach the United States, the short answer is that any state or non-state actor with nuclear capability can reach a target if they're determined and lucky. Specifically, if you can deliver a nuclear weapon on a ship or in a truck, and you can have devastating results if it's delivered the same as if it was delivered by a missile. But that means that the weapon must be small enough to deliver and get through a lot of layers of intelligence and defense systems, particularly if you're going after the United States. I'm not losing any sleep over that tonight. Now, as far as missile system delivery specifically, there are two likely scenarios that the North Koreans would probably be working towards, and I think are working towards. The first is a submarine-launched ballistic missile. And you can look at a submarine moving close enough to our shores to deliver a weapon. But the North Koreans really have two challenges. First, they actually have to successfully shoot, and the one they used was a Bluegensong, the KN-11 SLBM, and you've probably seen footage on that. Frankly, I looked at it. It looks like a Scud missile that's photoshopped pretty well. So good on them if that's actually a Photoshop. But that's what it looks like to me, is a Scud missile coming out of the water. And then secondly, you have to have a small enough nuclear warhead that can get on that missile, and that's not an insignificant or insurmountable thing. And then the second option is, besides the SLBM, is the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. And so, yes, they have missiles that can reach the United States. I mean, when you look at the ranges from their capital to Seoul, it's about 120 miles. To Tokyo is about 800 miles. To Hawaii is about 4,500 miles or so. San Diego add another about 6,000 miles, and then to D.C. would be about 7,000, just short of that. They have some missiles that can certainly reach Hawaii, but there's a huge difference between having a missile that can fly that far and a missile that you can put a warhead on. And then on top of that, the United States Navy and the Air Force and others have a pretty darn good system to be able to take stuff like that out of the sky. So, again, I'm not losing any sleep over that tonight. But this is an issue we need to start dealing with seriously. And I know several presidents have worked hard at this, but we need to keep pushing. And I really applaud both sides of the House and Senate or the House for voting on this today.
Let's, before we go into a greater threat that you've discussed before, and that is in biological weapons, there is a tie here, and I don't want to get too far off, but I want to connect a dot, and that is the dot between North Korea and Iran. And how much concern should it be to us that, in effect, some have said that North Korea is actually the Iranian nuclear program partner, or if not, their effective test site?
I lose a lot of sleep over whether or not the Iranians or who the Iranians are sharing technology with. And I think all those that are in their neighborhood should be even more concerned about it. And it's not just the Iranians, it's others. So, yes, I'm worried about their missile technology in particular, but also their explosive or kinetic technology. So I think that's something we need to keep a very close eye on.
All right, now let's go to a greater threat, as you've talked about before. Not that nuclear weapons, be it fission or fusion, hydrogen or atomic, but biological weapons and a threat to the United States. Do you still feel that that is a greater threat at this time? And how would that threat, let's get a little bit into the how someone would carry out that threat.
Okay, I'm not going to do a how-to because I think that would be a bad idea. But in general, if you go back and look through history and you look at the 1340s, 1345 Black Plague in Europe, about 75 million people died of the plague. Now compare that, if you will, to Hiroshima, where between 60 and 80,000 died, and Nagasaki 70,000 died. So that's, believe me, I'm not saying that's not an insignificant. One person is insignificant, but the death of 150,000 is a lot of people. But it's very small compared to 75 million people that died of the Black Plague. Now, if you look at today, current day, and say between March of 14 and January of 16, just over, a year and change there, we had over 11,000 people in 6 countries die of Ebola. And, oh, by the way, one of those countries was the United States. So it was Liberia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Mali. So when you look at these countries and you say 11,000 people died of that, and we've done a pretty good job, the medical community has done a great job through the Center of Disease Control and the World Health Organization. But the spread from an epidemiological standpoint is much more deadly than I'll call it one shot, one kill, which is what you get from a nuclear weapon.
And again, I we don't want to carry out a class here, which I know you're more than well qualified with your background to do, but we don't want to carry out a class. But defense against biological, medical community, the public, the role of the public and the role of the government. Right.
So there's a study that comes out each year on this, and I will tell you we're getting a lot better on this, and it was proof with Ebola. I mean, Ebola could have been significantly worse had CDC and the World Health Organization not been up on their game. But that said, it still spread rapidly. And by the way, that 11,315, which is I think the number that they reported, is probably low because there are a lot of folks that died of Ebola, I believe, that we'll never know they died of Ebola because of where they were at the time in the world. But the bottom line is we're getting better as a world. We're certainly getting better as the United States. We're getting better with our sensors, so that's a good news thing. And we're getting much better at being able to create immunizations faster. And a lot of that goes to the civilian companies. You know, the Johnson & Johnsons of the world do a great job of finding ways to rapidly develop, figure out what it is that's a threat and then develop the immunization to counter that threat. And it's something that changes constantly.
So we've got the threat, we've got the defense, the final, point on this segment, and I know we have many more in the future, but that is the policy. And, we can't ignore the role of politics. We have the private sector, yes, but the role of policy that comes out of the federal government in dealing with these threats.
Yeah, absolutely true. And, David, you and I have talked about not only this, but the cyber threat in the past. And when you look at, for instance, U.S. code, and you look at Title 10 is for the military, Title 22 is State Department, Title 50 is intelligence. What is that title that does cyber? What is that title that does that combination between medical and national security? And that's where the policies, this is very difficult, but that's where the policy has to begin to catch up and then stay up with technology as it changes, whether that's a threat from Ebola or something else, or that's a threat from an organization like ISIS. So I think you hit a very key point there, is that the policy and being able to respond as a country more rapidly is key to this whole effort.
Well, we are going to get into the cyber at a longer, probably going to be an hour-long special. We'll have to get into soon between you. I'll invite Morgan Wright and others, and we'll discuss it from a number of angles. because I think there's a dearth of information and understanding by the general public, and then that leads to just, well, lack of understanding, and that's not a good thing. That is not a good thing at all in our society.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you there.
Dr. William Parker, Chief Operating Officer at the East West Institute, now retired. So, I can call you Captain still, Captain Bill Parker. You'll recognize that name, folks, if you don't recognize the voice. But a distinguished man of letters and someone who's working to get the education that you need out to you, and that's where we put it on this show. The East West Institute is there for you. You can take a look at their website, eastwest.ngo. And I look forward to your next appearance on the show, Bill. We'll talk soon.
Thanks a lot, David. Great talking to you.